Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. Thank you for joining the webinar series. Once again, if you're rejoining us, or hello if this is your first session with us, we've got a whole host of talks, and today I'm really excited to bring on Liz Warner, who has run 30 marathons before the age of 30 and the 30-30 challenge, and we're going to be talking about that, but also her journey through sport, endurance, and most importantly, what she's learnt from other people in the countries that she's been to. So thank you, Liz, for joining us. And she is also an Empathy Week ambassador, which is great to have. And so thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully, I haven't really introduced you much beyond being an endurance athlete, but you're also a consultant as well, and you're currently living in Paris, so thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This is really fun, and it's good to catch up with you, Ed, and hear more about Empathy Week too.
Yeah, amazing. So last week we had Empathy Week take place. Students are now across the world, hopefully, doing some empathy action projects, and these kind of webinars are aimed at kind of students 13 plus, although we often have a few adults sneak in to watch the webinars as well. But really, I wanted to invite you on because you've done something really incredible. But before we get to kind of the marathons, I wanted to pick up on just the first point, that you're American. You're born in Atlanta, is that right?
Yes, good memory.
And now you're in Paris. So
Yes.
there's a story around empathy there, just in the fact that you are from one country and you're now living in a completely different country. How has that come about, and why have you moved to another country? And yeah, what's the beginnings of your story?
Of course. So yes, I grew up in Atlanta. Both my parents were from New York, and my father, it's an interesting story. His dream was to go to medical school, but he got rejected from every medical school in the US. And so at the age of 21, he randomly got into a medical school in Paris. And he didn't speak French, but he decided to sort of throw himself in this adventure of moving to France and going to medical school here and sort of carving out a life for him in France. And I think from his experience, I sort of always grew up looking up to people who kind of threw themselves in crazy situations and seeing what happened. And so I went to university in the U.S., but after to a really small college in Maine, which is in the northern part of the country. But during college, I spent 4 months living in Vietnam. And it really sort of triggered this love of kind of living outside of my comfort zone and pushing myself to learn different languages and meet as many really fascinating people as I could, and just understanding different cultures. And I really, for as long as I can remember, really see sort of talking to strangers and hearing their stories and understanding different backgrounds different than my own, that is truly the greatest gift in life. And that's been the way that I've learned the most about the world, is through just meeting different people. And so I knew that after graduating university, I wanted to continue to live abroad. So I applied to every single type of job, internship, across Asia, specifically in China and Japan, and I got an internship in Tokyo. And so right after college, I decided to move there for this internship, which turned into a job. I met my now husband in Japan, and I think from there, I've just always, my energy comes from being in a place that I'm unfamiliar with, and meeting so many different people that teach me endless things about the world. So yeah, that's sort of my story. And then from there, after I spent 5 years in Japan, and I decided, I did speak French because that was really what my dad wanted me, my sister, my brother to do when we were younger. So I had this kind of language tool, and I knew I didn't want to move back to the US quite yet. So I applied to go back to school in Paris, and that's what brought me here. And I've been here now for 4 years.
Amazing. So a few places you've been to. Um, yeah, I didn't know. Sorry, I didn't even know you'd been to Japan, and it's really interesting to hear your story of, you know, wanting to explore places and wanting to understand what other people do, and it kind of then I can see why potentially you had that this challenge came up. But I
Yeah,
want to like get more into that. So you're approaching 30, or you're a year and a half away from turning 30, and you
yeah,
set out on a challenge to run 30 marathons in
yeah,
30 different countries.
yeah.
Why and how did you come up with that idea, and what was the like the inception of that idea?
Of course. So, you know, it's funny. I finished my master's program in Paris, and I got, you know, I was working for a year at a company I didn't really enjoy working at. I didn't, my values didn't really align with their values. It was actually a PR company, and I was working for artists and designers. It was very kind of like this luxury world that, you know, was interesting to a certain extent, but it was just not what I wanted to spend the majority of my day doing and promoting. So when I got married, actually, which was a year into the job, I sort of had this, I took a month off, and it sort of gave me this window of time to really question what I was doing. And I think also, you know, not that I was ever against marriage, and I absolutely love my husband to death, but I didn't want this to mean like I was settling in my life. And I think the idea of settling kind of scared me, not to the extent that I didn't want to stay in one place, but I felt like I wanted to continue to push myself in a lot of different directions to see where I could end up afterwards. And I knew if I can continue to stay at this job, I would be in the same place probably 5 years later. And I think that was what really pushed me to you know, come up with this idea. You know, it really was simple enough that I absolutely loved running, and I wanted to use my passion to do something that was, you know, that impacted the world outside of my
Mm.
personal bubble. And again, I didn't really know what that would entail at first. Like, I came up with the idea, you know, what if I ran 30 marathons before I turned 30? I was 28 at the time. I had a year and a half left to complete this goal. But I think, you know, the traveling and marathon aspect was really exciting, of course, but when the idea really started to take shape and meaning, when I actually combined each of the marathons with partnering with a different women-focused NGO in every country. So I came back from my honeymoon after having this kind of like light bulb moment that this was what I wanted to do with my life. I had a meeting with my previous company and about extending my contract for another 2 years and them sponsoring my visa. And I said, you know what, like, I have this gut feeling that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying because I feel like I really worked hard to get to a point where I felt quote unquote comfortable in my life. Like, finally, my husband, we were living on the same continent because for a while we were in different countries. I had this job that was, you know, many people would consider it a respectable path, and
Mhm.
here I was just sort of throwing this all away to sort of embark on this journey that was a little bit, that many people honestly didn't understand. And why would I decide to do something that was so unpredictable and uncertain, and would I even be able to physically run all these races? But you know, I feel like I always knew that this, to me, is what life is all about, is just continuing to push yourself and living a fearless life. And even if I failed, I knew it would be an amazing story that I at least tried. So I essentially had 2 months to plan everything. before I went on for the first marathon and the first race. And I think that was like a really overwhelming time, because it wasn't just choosing the races that I would go to. It was figuring out, of course, the budget, and really figuring out how I thought it would be really easy to get sponsorship. It turns out it's quite difficult when you're planning everything last minute. But on top of all that, it was, I had to choose all the NGOs that I was going to work with. And that required reaching out to so many. And I didn't want to just work with any NGO. I honestly spent hundreds of hours during those 2 months researching and trying to sort of develop my own vetting process to figure out which NGOs were really transparent in what they do, and sort of really, kind of checked all the boxes that would make me really excited to work with them, and also fundraise for them and promote their work. And ultimately, going to these countries and running these races, I wanted to not necessarily be traveling the whole time in these countries, but really showcasing the work of these NGOs while I was there. So yeah, it was a big undertaking.
I bet your husband was really pleased when you came back from your honeymoon and was like, well, I'm going to 30 countries. And what did he say?
We have very different memories of when I told him. Like, I remember exactly the moment when I had this idea. And again, when I first came up with the idea, it was purely just around running and traveling in marathons. And I said, and I kind of was like, okay, I would love to do this goal of running 30 marathons before I turn 30. And I remember him turning me in, and he was like, Liz, you haven't run more than one marathon in a year. Like, how do you expect to run over 20 in 1 year? And but he doesn't remember that. He remembers being fully supportive.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, but I think, again, I became very quickly obsessed with this whole idea of the project for the remainder of my honeymoon. It's all I could talk about. And so I think he could really see how much I was lighting up. And I mean, he is also a believer in throwing yourself in crazy situations. And as soon as I returned from that trip, I was probably spending 20 out of 24 hours of the day working on it. And I think, again, I'd never felt passionate about anything like that in my life, which again was an indicator that I absolutely needed to do this. And so, we had just gotten married and we had exchanged these vows. And I think, being committed to someone, you need to support them in sort of any really amazing project that they want to get involved with. So, to be honest, and we had mastered the whole long distance thing. So if anything, I think it was a little bit disappointing for him to finally be in the same place. And then it was like, okay, I'm going to leave you for another year and a half. But I think he knew how excited I was about it. And ultimately he came and traveled with me a little bit during the whole journey as well. So yeah, but that was definitely, interesting.
There's quite a few interesting sort of themes that are running true of other people that I'm speaking to and interviewing. And one is kind of having that purpose or that passion, and throwing yourself just fully into it.
Yes.
Because it's interesting that I think a lot of people think when you come up with an idea or anything that's not normal, like you've just said, I had a great job, I'd been working towards this, just got married, things from the outside may look great, and I'm ready to take on the world and progress up a career ladder. But actually you then stepped away from that and said, no, actually this is what lights me up, this is what I'm enjoying. And that seems to be the case, that a lot of people that go on to try and do something or lead through purpose, from the outside it does look a bit strange, or it does look a bit weird.
Yes.
When did you find that moment where, because I imagine the first marathon you did, you probably didn't have much support and you just went, right, I'm just going to go and do it. And I'm actually just going to go and start. When did you notice there being like a shift in, because you're a great example, and I'm going to ask you more questions on this later, of like how you can use social media to galvanize the power of humanity and how you can use it to actually drive forward purpose. When was it that you noticed that people started going, oh God, that Liz is a bit crazy and she's just gone off and done this, to actually like, wow, that's cool, and I want to support you? Did you notice there being a shift?
I think probably a few months into the project, after I had run a few marathons for Run to Reach, I think people started to actually realize that I was taking this project very seriously, and that it wasn't just, because I think especially when you come up with these crazy ideas, it's one thing to tell so many people about it, which of course I was doing that for several months, but it's another thing to actually really commit to it and start actually doing all the things. And going back to this whole social media component of my project, I think what was really challenging is that I started from zero. Like, I started Run to Reach and I had 0 followers, and it was a very organic buildup because I was literally messaging random people that I didn't know on these social channels, just telling them about my project. Would you follow me, because I just need people to follow along. Like, that's part of the adventure, because ultimately, like, yes, this was an experience for myself. I was very much listening and learning to all of the people I was meeting along the way, but it was also, I think what was really important for me was to also share the experience with others, especially since I'd be traveling by myself. And so I think the switch was when I think the people around me, my friends and family, started taking the project seriously once I was a few marathons in, and they could see how dedicated and passionate I was about creating a really strong, almost like awareness campaign about the country, the issues, the NGO, and of course the race itself too. And it really just became my life. And then I think also 6 months into the project, I had gained enough momentum with kind of like outreach and followers that when I arrived to these races, even people started knowing me as like the crazy girl who's running 30 marathons. So I think that's also was when, it was a very gradual kind of expansion of awareness about my project. But I think what did make it interesting is that it just started from zero at the very beginning.
Yeah, amazing. And what you just said there about, actually a lot of these places you were going on your own,
Yeah.
actually. And I've got a list here of a few of them, like that you went to: South Korea, Japan, Myanmar, Oman, USA, Mongolia. And the one that really stuck out for me, and I think this is definitely because of, obviously we all see the world through our own perspective, but through my context, Afghanistan was the one that stood out to me, because in my head, you can only get to Afghanistan on a military plane still, right? That's kind of the preconceived idea that I have and that many other people had. And I remember just kind of following your journey and being like, oh my gosh, she's gone to Afghanistan. I didn't even know that was possible. Like, can you get a visa?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to single Afghanistan out, but I think for a lot of people that would, still struggling with war and things like that.
Of course.
How did you feel doing that? And you went to Afghanistan on your own, I believe. Is that
Yes,
right? Yeah.
I did. It was interesting. I think when I was first planning Run to Reach, for me, it was almost like a year-long sabbatical from life. And so I kind of selfishly planned to travel to places that I wanted to see, like, for example, the Seychelles and Cuba. Of course, there are marathons in most countries in the world now. But probably it was around 6 months into the project. I was running a race in Sierra Leone, again, a country that not many people have traveled to. And, there was like, again, a switch that went off in my head. This project would be infinitely more, fascinating for not only for me, but for other people if I really tried to go to places that very few people have traveled to before. And at that moment, I scrapped all of my project, all the countries that I had been planning to go to, and instead chose places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia. And with Afghanistan, it was really interesting because the marathon there is not advertised at all, because for security reasons. There's a long waiting list, surprisingly, because I think there are a lot of intrepid travelers that kind of want that crazy experience of going to this country that is, you know, often associated with war and terrorism and violence. But I reached out to the organizer, and luckily it was a few months ahead of time, and told them about my project. And they actually paired me up with the NGO I ended up traveling with there, called Free to Run. And it could not have been more of a serendipitous situation, because of course I was working with women-focused organizations, and Free to Run, they actually provide safe spaces for Afghan women to participate in sport. Because you know, even before traveling there, I had no idea that in some places of the world, of course, it's not always safe for women to run publicly, but you know, in Afghanistan, it's, you know, it's life-threatening for women to just go out for a jog or, you know, train for a race. And women constantly are harassed on the street and called terrible names and having rocks thrown at them simply for going out for a run. And so it was an incredibly powerful experience having the opportunity to go there, because again, not only was I getting to see this beautiful country, that the race itself took part in a country that called Bamyan, that has this national park there that's just gorgeous, like, you know, these beautiful mountains. I can show you photos afterwards. And again, it was just kind of surreal to be there and to be looking at this expansive mountainscape, and again, kind of trying to you know, reconcile with the fact that for all of my life I've associated with this place with terrible images. And in fact, there is a lot of peace in Afghanistan. The people, especially the women there, I think even our image, the image of women in Afghanistan is probably that they're oppressed or that they're, you know, fully veiled. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. I spent 2 weeks with the women there, and they were, you know, had fierce characters, you know, were reading Michelle Obama's book Becoming, and were telling me, you know, how much they love Justin Bieber. And, you know, they were, I think in all these trips, you just realize obviously how similar you are to so many people who are oftentimes othered by the media, or even, you know, by ourselves in the Western world. So, but yeah, it was an incredible experience. And I ended up running the race with 50 Afghan women who had been training for months for this marathon. And so I think, again, you know, running a marathon is many times an individual experience, but for a lot of these races, getting to participate with local people made it so much more of a meaningful experience. And so, yeah.
It's an amazing story. That, I mean, it's an extreme way to go outside of your comfort zone and learn about other people, but it's such an interesting, you know, for students watching and that will watch this back as well, you know, that idea that you can, like you've just said, go and meet people who are completely different to yourself, surround yourself with people completely different, and your own ideas will be challenged, whether
Yeah.
that's the ideas you've got from the media or society that you've been brought up in.
Yeah.
And you mentioned you had some photos, and I know that I've asked you to prepare a few because I've been seeing them on social media and things. And I think it's a perfect time to sort of show that the journey of those countries that you've visited, just to have a
Yes.
visual element as well.
Let's see.
So
Of course, let me share my screen. Okay, let me bring them up. Okay, can you see them here?
yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
So this was the start of this was a different marathon. This was in Afghanistan. This was in Kabul, one of the mosques there, and
Wow.
just really beautiful. And again, this was in Afghanistan with all of the women that I ran the race with, and they just, you know, so full of life. And yeah, just running. I think also going there, it was so powerful to realize how much of a empowering force running can be in so many people's lives. You know, it's so much more than simply putting one foot in front of the other. It's really allowed all of these women in this picture to sort of gain confidence and, you know, allow them to realize their potential and to sort of allow themselves to dream up these big ideas, for them to um, to pursue in the future. So I'm trying to see what other photos I put in here. If I'm not going. Okay, let me see.
It's amazing to see that just even those mountains there
Yeah.
with them, and they all look really young as well.
Yes.
Girls that are running.
Yes. They were really young. I think they were less than 20, all of them. So, you know, and I think finishing the race with all of them, and just obviously, I think for me, I cry after every marathon, no matter where it is in the world. It's always a very big moment for me. But I think actually after finishing that particular marathon in Afghanistan, I think I was just in shock. And instead of like, as soon as I crossed the finish line, I immediately turned to them to see what their reaction was. I almost just forgot about what I was feeling because I just wanted to see, I wanted to see their reaction and to see just how much of a profound moment this was for in their lives. And yeah, it was just really overwhelming. There were a lot of tears involved, but I think being able, yeah, to spend those couple of weeks with them and to hear so many of their stories, and you know, they were incredibly open, and you know, there are a lot of limitations there, but I think still, I mean, there were a few of those girls in this picture that were telling me how much they want to become the president of Afghanistan one day. And very few of these girls actually want to leave Afghanistan because they realize how much potential there is for the country, and how, yeah, how society is changing for them. So I think that was also really amazing to hear, is just how much hope they have for their own lives and for their country too.
And just to switch the question a little bit as well, what do you think they learned from you? Do you think I'm sure they probably had stereotypes of, right, an American woman, you know,
Yes.
lives in Paris, who's traveled, who's, you know, wealthy or wealthier than they are, whatever. They had a lot of probably ideas about you. Did they ever speak about that or say, oh, you're not what we expect? Or
you know, I think during all of these trips, I never wanted to talk or tell my story. And I think they were always, I think what sometimes can be my greatest flaw, but also one of my greatest strengths, is that I ask so many questions. And so I think there was a point, like one of the girls in this picture was just like, you know, you ask so many questions, like we want to know about where you come from and you in your life. And I think that was interesting for me because I definitely I was hyper aware of not coming off as like someone who, you know, who's obviously privileged and has been able to see the world, and that I'm swooping into these countries and saving these countries. Like, no, like if anything, I wanted to listen to these girls, their experiences, and to raise awareness about the organizations that are supporting them. And so I did feel, you know, I was actually asked to give a small presentation to these girls, but it and I did feel a little bit funny about it because you know, at the end of the day, I was asked from one of these girls, well, I could never do this project that you're doing. You know, you're really inspiring to me. I very much admire what you're doing and all the countries that you're getting to see, but I simply could never dream of doing that. And that's never my message to spread to, especially some of the girls and people that I meet along this trip. Like, I very much appreciate the fact that this adventure that I was fortunate enough to do. It's, you know, it can't be done by everyone in the world. But I think the message I hope to instill in all these girls is that dream big, and you know, you don't have to run races around the world to have an impact in your community. And for me, it just so happened that this is something that I got to do, and I just made it happen. But I know all of these girls, they're already paving the way for other girls who are younger than them to be independent and to strive for a bigger life than what is often expected of them in Afghanistan. And that in itself is going to have a much bigger difference than even probably the impact I had with this own project. So it's just, dreaming big and also, being creative on how to find solutions to make this dream a reality. So that's sort of what the message I hope to share to others. And but that definitely, I think, was a little bit difficult at times, because I think they did sort of look at my life, and of course it was inspiring to them, but it at the end of the day, they are living in Afghanistan. They are every day dealing with very different circumstances than all of us. So it was just having sort of a realistic conversation as well.
Yeah, and that sounds really, really tough, actually, that, when they're saying, quite heartbreaking, oh, I'll never be able to do this. But I think, like you say, if you focus on the inspiring bits of it and more about, well, what can you do in your circumstances? And that sounds very easy to say, but I think I'm drawing parallels to Pankaj's story, which was from Empathy Week last year.
Yeah.
And he's actually going to be talking on Friday. But he was saying about how, he lives in this is just my experience, but like in India, in like slum area in his village, although he doesn't live in technically a slum area, but his house is made out of, basically mud and a few bricks and things, but the outer exterior. And he washes with, gets water from a well, washes with a bucket and everything. And I said to him, if I showed people your life and your story, they would say that you live in poverty. And he just kind of laughed. And he did used to live in poverty, but he doesn't anymore. But he still lives in the same house and still washes in the same way. And I said to him, if I could give you an opportunity to live in London or live in the UK, would you take it? And he said, no, my family's here, my life is here. Why would I want to do that? And we've got this perception that West is best and, iPhones and this and that. And actually the reality is that people I've met, and I'm sure this is your case as well, is that people with the least amount of material goods and potentially the least opportunities actually are the most grateful and the most the happiest people, because they have what's in front of them and they don't dwell on all these could haves or might haves, and they just focus on that scenario. And I just wondered, is there a particularly, I know we've talked about Afghanistan a lot, but obviously you've been to lots of countries. Is there a particular like person or someone that you've met that really stands out for you, that where you developed your empathy maybe more than other countries, or where you just really got an understanding of another culture or another person that you wouldn't have otherwise had?
Yeah, sort of piggybacking on what you just said about, this idea that being materially rich is sort of what we all as a world strive for, and sort of, yes, visiting a lot of communities that from a naked eye would look, quote unquote, in poverty or poor. One of the third races I did in this project, it was the Sahara Marathon. It took place in Western Sahara. And I think what was really interesting about this marathon is that I personally knew very little about the area that I was going to. And the marathon took place in a refugee camp that is actually one of the oldest refugee camps in the world, with over, I think, 170,000 Sahrawi refugees. And as part of this marathon, I went with an NGO there, the NGO I was working with, and actually lived with the family in the camps for a couple of weeks before the race. And it was exactly that. I think, these are people who are living off of food rations and, UN food aid. And, I developed a pretty deep connection with my host sister, who again was just very open about everything in her life. And I remember she was telling me that she was hoping to get married in the next year, and but her family was having some difficulties, and so they couldn't plan the wedding. And so as soon as I was getting ready to leave the camps, I sort of wanted to leave her the rest of the local money that I had. And she to be able to plan this wedding that she was talking so much about. And she, she really thanked me. But what she said was that, she couldn't take my money, because if any of her neighbors needed help, if any of her like community members needed any sort of help, she would have to give that money towards, to their whatever they needed it for, and that she would feel so badly that if she, that I would give this money for her wedding and she couldn't actually use it for her wedding. And I think it was kind of, again, this crazy switch that went off in my head, is just realizing how deep community ties can be, not just between family members, but between sort of these societies that have to endure so many challenges. But there's something so rich in having these strong community ties that, I hate to say it, like in the West, we just simply do not have that. We live on our own individual terms, and I think a lot of our misery comes from just being like in our isolated bubbles and kind of in this rat race to strive for X, Y, and Z. And what gives abundance and richness to, especially this particular refugee communities, is just being there for each other and having these incredibly close community ties that I've never really witnessed in other Western parts of the world. And again, it just goes back to what you were saying, is that you can be so materially poor, but so rich on so many other levels that, you do have to question yourself, like, what is life about? And to me, life is about relationships, it's about community ties. And so I've left that whole experience it really reshaped my thinking of like, what does rich really mean? What does having a successful life really mean? And not to say that, again, I'm sure that many of these refugees would actually leave their situation because there's very, very little opportunity there. But at the same time, I know for a fact that my host sister is very happy and leads a fulfilling life just based on the really deep relationships that she shares with the people in her community.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, to think that someone would choose to stay in that situation, but maybe that's what the world and society has wrong, is this idea of success and what, like you've just said, what success is and what makes you fulfilled in a way. And obviously you've now finished kind of your 30 marathons in 30 countries. Even during a pandemic, you managed to find some ways to kind of move around that. How did you finish that? I think you were 3 months away, weren't you? 3 or 4 months away from finishing.
Yeah.
And obviously the world locked down. How did you iterate around your thing? Because that's what I want to also get across to students, is students now be thinking about their empathy action projects, or they'll be thinking about, right, I want to do something, and they'll have a clear plan in your head. And you've already said that, in fact, after the first 6 months, you moved on and you were like, no, actually, I need to change the plan. And that's okay. And I want to get that into the hearts and minds of young people watching, that you can have an idea and you can change it. Even in fact, Empathy Week, iterates itself every year. We change. I'm already thinking about 2022 and how things are going to be different and better. But obviously you were hit with a curveball where you didn't have the choice to change it, and you just had to. How did you do that, and what did you do to achieve your goal still?
Yeah, of course. It was a really crazy situation because the 27th marathon, I was actually, so right when the world was shutting down, I was on this very, almost a desert island off of Yemen. And I didn't have any internet access for 10 days. And again, this is when borders were shutting, and I did bring a satellite phone with me. And so I remember talking to my family in the US, and they were freaking out that I would be sort of stranded on this island. But my sister said, Liz, I know you can't read the news right now, but you're probably going to have to, postpone the end date of your project. Everything is going to be canceled, and that's okay. We'll figure out another way, etc. And for me, not even for a second did I feel sorry for myself that I had to sort of put a lot of the bigger end marathons on pause, or that they were getting canceled. I sort of got back to Paris. Luckily, I was able to get back, and you make lemonade out of lemons. Like I feel like that's been my motto for life, for everything that I've done. Life is always about adapting and pivoting, and so for the second to last race, I actually, I kind of put out a few feelers, like how would my community, the community that I've built, that it's now following me, how would you feel about joining me for a virtual marathon in Paris, or I would be running in Paris. And I had a month long to sort of plan this virtual race, and it actually ended up being probably one of the most rewarding experiences out of the whole journey. One of them. I mean, there are many rewarding experiences, but I think what was so cool, I made it a goal for myself to try to get runners from over 100 countries involved, and that definitely required me to send out, again, many messages to people I did not know on social media from very random countries like Bhutan, Djibouti, Venezuela, and tell them about my project. I'm organizing this virtual race that is supporting the WHO's COVID-19 response fund, and surprisingly, people were really enthusiastic about it. I think people felt really proud to represent their countries. I kind of had to figure out, like, there's so many virtual challenges happening. How could I make people really kind of want to be signed up to mine? So this virtual race ended up raising the most amount of money out of all of my marathons by far. And I think it was just so empowering to feel like, even though it was a virtual race, but to feel like I was running with runners from all over the world that were joining my project for this second to last race. And so yeah, it was a beautiful experience. And again, I'm just such a firm believer that, do not wallow in self-pity out of any situation that's not going as planned. Like, it's an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to sort of throw yourself in a situation that you never could have planned for, but it could end up being an opportunity you learn the most from as well. And that ended up being, an experience that was the most rewarding. So that was very cool experience at the end.
Yeah, amazing. And I really like what you said there about, changing it and actually thinking, how do I involve people? Because I think so much of what we see is, we see a problem and then we come up with a solution. And it doesn't necessarily involve people within that solution. And you've actually invited people there, whether it's virtually or not, to actually take part. And therefore, actually, by engaging people for them to take part in something, there's more exactly what you've just mentioned about traveling the world. It's the connection, it's the relationships that you build that actually then build on the ability to improve people's lives, rather than just throwing money at something or just throwing resources. One kind of last question to finish up on: what is your advice to students who they might even have the money to travel, or might have the sponsorship or whatever, but they can't because they're young, they're teenagers, or they're at university, or they have other commitments, but they see you and they see your story and they want to have an impact? What's your advice to them? How do you start? How do you change something that you're passionate about, or really move towards a goal? How do you do that?
I would say, if it's sort of a social impact kind of project, which I'm assuming it is, even for me growing up, I was sort of, my interests really were scattered across many different areas. And my advice would be, choose a cause, choose maybe not necessarily one cause, but just a few causes that you can really devote your energy and resources to. And because I think there are thousands of NGOs across the world, and that I feel like that's overwhelming to many. It was overwhelming for me. How do I even choose an organization to work with that that I felt was really impactful and effective in what they do. But I think it does require doing your research, and it requires, educating yourself on a deeper level to one particular cause or just a few. And so that would actually be my advice, is really, when you're young, find that one cause you're really, really passionate about, and kind of brainstorm and figure out ways that you could creatively support that mission, or if that's just raising awareness about it in some creative way. I mean, there's so many different ways. You don't necessarily need to go around the world running marathons, but how can you kind of combine your passions, whether that's running or cycling or something that's not even physical, with that cause. I mean, there's so many really amazing opportunities out there. So I think it's just keeping the ideas simple, and figuring out a way to really combine your passions with a cause that you're really feeling connected to, and that maybe is greater than yourself, is a much bigger problem than maybe what is immediately in front of you too.
I love that. Keep it simple, keep your passions involved, and think about just, I suppose, impacting one person's life, and then that can spread.
Yes.
Liz, thank you so much for joining. How can people who've listened to this, follow your next, because I'm sure you've got things in the pipeline, but how can people join or message you or follow what you're up to? Where can they find you?
Of course. So I'd say the best way to follow me still is through Instagram. My project is called Run to Reach, RUNTOREACH. And I post regularly on there. I'm actually in the process of redoing my website, so soon there will be a new website for Run to Reach. So I would be honored for you to follow along still my journey.
Amazing. Thank you, Liz, so much. Thank you to those that have tuned in today and those that will listen in the future. We have loads more webinars coming up this week, so please come and listen to those, and lots of different things. But thank you very much, Liz. Really great to have you on, and good luck with all the things that you're doing in the future.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.